Welcome to Convergence.fm. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanand. On the show, we explore how purpose-driven leaders align their culture, operations, and experimentation to de-risk the decisions that really matter and lead AI-enabled businesses with clarity. Convergence.fm. Transform from the inside out. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Convergence.fm. On today's episode, we're going to talk about some stuff that came out of a workshop that we ran for CEOs recently. And I think there's a lot of nuggets that every business owner or operator needs to hear right now from that workshop. These were CEOs that were on a retreat in their group, and we were brought in to do a 3-hour hands-on AI session for them. The attendees were leading established companies, areas like manufacturing, construction, distribution, professional services. These are operators that are running real businesses with real payrolls and had been around for at least 10 years. In some cases, they were second and third generation in their families to run this business. People who have built something meaningful over decades and gone through a whole bunch of stuff in that time. And as is typical for our workshops, before we walk in the room, we send them a survey to get up to speed on where they're at and to get to know them a little bit more and what areas of their business they're most focused on. What the survey revealed, we asked a couple of questions that ended up being the most important things that we designed the workshop around. The first question was, we asked them to imagine 3 years from now, and their businesses had exceeded every goal they set. And if they were to look back to today, what's some of the biggest constraints they had to overcome to get there? What's interesting for an AI session was that not a single person described technology as the turning point. The answers spanned a sales force that resists change, IT team that's obstacle to evolution and innovation, not knowing where to find outside resources to hold them accountable, a marketing team that were C players that needed to be led. And then we asked the other question of where we thought AI would create the most meaningful impact in their business. And despite all these answers, over 80% of them said that it was going to be in sales and demand generation. Now there's a gap there. When asked to imagine future success, they described human and organizational constraints. But when asked about AI, they answered it almost like it was a sales shortcut. Now, those two answers weren't in alignment, and that disconnection, we find, is a pretty common thing when we walk into a room like this. Another thing we asked them was if every employee in their business suddenly became 10 times more productive, what would become the constraint or what would break in their business? Two people in the same room gave very opposing answers. One said operations wouldn't be able to keep up, and another hilariously said that his bank account would literally break open, meaning that he would be able to sell more than they could supply. Same tool, completely different starting points. And I think it's a similar mistake that many companies make when they go looking for an AI solution before they get a clear picture on, maybe call it a system diagram of how they generate profit and where the constraints are. When we asked them about confidence levels, the answer that they provided was 4.7 out of 10. Experienced operators, people who would survive recessions, competitive threats, market shifts, regulation changing, and here we're sitting at less than a 5 out of 10 on whether their business would thrive in the AI era. And that number is what's going to frame this episode. Here's the thing about that 4.7. I love that they were open and honest and weren't lying to themselves, each other, or us. And part of what's driving that was a reasonable instinct that had suddenly become dangerous. For most of business history, when a new technology emerged, we tended to have time. We could watch it mature. Let someone else take the risk first before we need to do it ourselves. Maybe you wait for the economies of scale and the price to come down and have a consultant come and teach us a playbook. That was smart. It worked. And the problem is that instinct is no longer matching this timeline. ChatGPT reached 100 million users within 2 months. Compared to that, television took 13 years, not 2 months to get there, and radio took nearly 40 years. So this isn't a technology that we have the same time or let alone a decade to observe before deciding whether to move and in what direction. This compression is real, and the rate of change is much faster than before, and it changes the calculus entirely. But here's the part that I think a lot of people miss. Speed of adoption isn't the only thing that's changed. What's also changed is the cost of waiting to redesign. Some other stories that I find interesting is that it was actually in the 1960s that AT&T introduced the picture phone or video calling. They spent about $500 million developing this technology, and they predicted 1 million users by 1980, 20 years later. Unfortunately, they peaked at 500 subscribers. The technology worked, as we know now, and as you're seeing me here. Video calling itself is not the problem. A lot of other things around it didn't make sense, like the cost structure, the behavior change required, the gap associated with how much change there was, the infrastructure to support it. And it wasn't until Skype and then later FaceTime and then, of course, the pandemic-related Zoom that decades later, people had devices with cameras in their pockets or on their desks, broadband in their homes, and at that point that we got to redesign our workflows and everything else in order to take advantage of it. The companies that invested in the original version without redesigning probably didn't get much for it. Another story I read about in an article recently was around the electric motor. In the late 1800s, factories started putting electric motors into their machines, but it wasn't for 30 years that the factories actually had more output. The overall output barely changed despite this thing that made the machine so much faster because no one redesigned the factory. The floor layouts were the same, the workflows were the same, and a faster motor was just sitting inside a system built for the old world. It wasn't until the early 1900s and Henry Ford introducing the assembly line that manufacturers finally captured the potential of the electric motor that had been promised for over 30 years by then. And it's not because the motor itself got that much better, it's because people started redesigning their businesses around it. That lag was 30 years. We don't have 30 years now to redesign. We still have to do that really hard work. As much as the adoption around us for AI is so much faster. Now, here's the thing that I think doesn't get said enough in these conversations. The tools that used to require enterprise budgets and dedicated engineering teams now can be as cheap as $20 a month in a matter of just going to Claude.ai and signing up. The same capability that only Fortune 500 companies were paying millions and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to access until recently is sitting on everyone's browser right now. So for these operators in that room, that could be good news because they have deep industry context. They had existing customer relationships with trust. They have proprietary data that's been accumulating for decades. And pairing that with using these new tools in a very intentional way gives them a level playing field against the Fortune 500s. But it cuts both ways. There are startups in their industry that are coming after their market share as well that have access to the same $20 tool. And in their case, they have no organizational debt. There's no existing systems or people to work around. There isn't a CIO who needs to approve it, a CHRO who needs to assess the liability, a CFO who needs to model the downside. They can move without asking permission because there's nobody to ask. The advantage for the small operators is the depth. The advantage for the startups is their speed. And right now, speed is winning way more than it used to. This is where I want to spend a minute on something pretty specific. Because in my opinion, I think this is a mistake and I see it happening constantly. A lot of companies have rolled out something like maybe Microsoft Copilot, and they call it their AI strategy. And I understand why. It's really easy to get started. It's already a contract you have signed with Microsoft. It integrates with your emails, your calendars. The CIO justifies it. But frankly, Copilot is not a reasonable lens of what AI can actually do for you. I wish it was. And it really fundamentally limits what your team can do with AI. And then unfortunately, they form an opinion of AI based on that experience. If you want your team to actually get a first-person sense of what's possible, I would highly recommend getting them access to things like Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini. These are frontier tools, and it's where the capability actually lives right now. And yes, get the enterprise licenses, don't use the free versions, and talk to your team about that. The difference matters. The agreements that you have can give you a lot more confidence around data sovereignty, meaning that your proprietary information isn't being used to train the models. And for a business with sensitive operational data, client data, or anything that constitutes a competitive advantage, that's not really optional. Actually, in the workshop, we even get into what it's like to host LLMs locally and use open source for stuff that we find to be particularly sensitive. The price of admission for these tools is something that's totally worth it. One more thing on tools, and this is the single most practical tip I can give you. First of all, you have to be using this yourself. And when you sit down and use any of these platforms, as you're asking it to do things, make sure that you include this part of the prompt where you say, ask me questions to gather more context before you answer. And I believe that one instruction changes the quality and context of everything that follows from the output of the AI. Instead of getting a generic response based on incomplete information, the AI starts to interview you and it surfaces the questions you didn't know to ask. It forces clarity on what you actually need, and it turns a mediocre output into something genuinely useful. That's the difference between someone who uses AI as a search engine and someone who uses it as a genuine thought partner to make better decisions and ultimately line up with better strategy before you set out to execute. I mentioned this already about using it yourself. The CEO has to get back in the saddle. This is the part of the conversation that really moved the room. Most established businesses are structured around protecting something that you've built. For example, your CIO's job is to make sure nothing breaks, the network stays up, nobody gets hacked. Your CHRO's job is to make sure that no one sues the business and the employees are well informed. Your CFO's job is to make sure that the numbers are clean, the risks are contained. And I think all of this is, of course, super essential. You've built something of value and you need to protect it, and none of that is optional. But no one's job description today specifically says, take calculated risks, redesign how we operate from the ground up. Those are much more offense positions, unlike the defense positions I just mentioned. And what most companies are doing right now is handing the AI strategy to their defensive coordinator, despite it being such early days where you're playing offense. When your CIO rolls out Copilot, they're not doing anything wrong. They're doing exactly what their job has asked them to do until today. They've probably denied someone using Claude today itself. And they're finding the most safest, defensible, cheapest option to roll out technology that minimizes exposure and fits inside the existing system. That may be the right move for the CIO today based on how you've held them accountable. But it's a wrong move for a company trying to compete in a redesigned market. I think the same thing will play out with your CHRO. You're definitely going to slow down any people-related AI initiative if you start to assess liabilities and completely outsource it to them and delegate it to them versus getting in the saddle yourself. These are not bad people making bad decisions. They're good people making decisions that are perfectly calibrated for their job, but that's a job that was defined for yesterday. Defense. Innovation has always carried risk, and it will today as well. It doesn't have to be reckless. It doesn't have to be unintentional. The skill is about being deliberate about which risks are worth taking and how you contain your downside while learning a lot more than you're building. Here's what it might look like in practice. One of the operators in the workshop had an accounts payable process where a majority of their invoices were going through double approval, and this was regardless of the dollar amount. The fix was simple. We set a threshold Anything under a certain amount requires only one approval, and technology helps filter this stuff. That decision consciously accepted a small amount of financial exposure, but we were able to contain it, but had a massive operational bottleneck that get unlocked. The CFO would have probably pushed back. And in this case, the operator made the call themselves. They took ownership of the downside, gave the CFO a safety net. And that's what maybe an intentional risk looks like. It's a specific trade-off made by the person with the authority to make it, and you're enabling them in service of a clearer outcome, which is finding efficiencies in this case. You can't make that call if you've delegated this to someone whose job is to say no. Think about whether your CIO, CFO, whose job is just to say no right now. We did a survey at the end about what their confidence scores were. And the ones who moved their confidence score the most weren't the ones who found the best tool or identified the biggest opportunity. They were the ones who felt it in their bones and accepted that this cannot be delegated, that the redesign starts with them getting personally familiar with the operations of their business again, and identifying what technology can do and how they need to redesign and enable their people to be in service of that. One of the operators in the room, I loved how they put it plainly as ever. He walked in at a 2 out of 10 confidence. But at the end, he said, you either adopt, monetize, or die. And he landed at an 8 in confidence by the end. That's not resignation, I think. That's a lot more clarity baked into that. And it's, in my opinion, an amazing starting point. Energetically, it made it worth my time to do it, hearing that output from him. So don't start by looking at your org chart. Start by looking for early adopters and the champions in your business. They likely already exist. They might be using AI tools in their own time for stuff at home. Maybe they're using it at work without your approval. Maybe they're using the free versions without you knowing, because they're curious and resourceful, and you need to provide them with direction and guardrails. Find those people, not necessarily the most senior people, not the people with the right title on this. These are the folks that are comfortable with using things and thinking through outcomes and okay with it not being perfect. Give them real tools like Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, and create a space where they can experiment, share back and forth with you, and share what you're learning. Be vulnerable and share with them and learn from them as well. This small group can become a nucleus for your institutional capability. It's at that point that you can start rebuilding your operating system around what you're learning with this small group. And you don't have to do it all at once with a massive transformation program. You can start with the constraint that's holding your business back the most from where you want to be 3 years from now. The workflow maybe is where the work is the slowest, decisions are the most opaque. Maybe institutional knowledge lives in one person's head and you got a big risk there. Those are places that you can start. And then from that first win, you can allow a snowball effect and momentum to build across the rest of the company. The other thing we talked about is governance and risk, and how there is, of course, defense that needs to be played. For example, not every piece of your business should be incorporated into an AI tool. Things like your trade secrets, proprietary process data, your client financials. I don't trust the foundational models yet, and I would recommend that you put those on a more private LLM. Whereas brainstorming, doing market research, things like that, I'd feel a little bit more comfortable with. I think the problem is that most companies haven't drawn these lines yet, which means that people are either using it outside of the boundaries or not using it at all because they haven't been encouraged. And so speaking of the confidence score though, I felt really proud of ourselves that we went from a 4.7 actually to a 7 in 3 hours. And this isn't because we gave people the answers. It's because we gave them a clear starting point and gave them clarity and confidence with the tool that they're playing with. And they could see this as something that's way more accessible than they thought. And I could see that why the session was rated an average of 9.8 out of 10. Thank you so much for listening to this. I hope it was helpful and it resonated. If you'd have any feedback for us, I'd love to hear from you on our contact page at convergence.fm or reach out to us at office hours at convergence.fm. If you lead a peer group through EO, YPO, Vistage, or something similar for CEOs and operators to come together, and you're interested in a session like this, we'd love to talk about that as well. Hit us up in the same spots. We are genuinely passionate about helping experienced operators move through this really momentous part of history with clarity and confidence rather than anxiety, so you can get really creative about how you wield these tools in service of where you want your business to be. The session that inspired this episode was rated 9.8 out of 10. We're not here to give a keynote. We're here to sit in a room with operators who know their businesses cold and help them with finding the right starting point. We'd love to set one up for you. Reach out to us at officehours@convergence.fm or go to our website, convergence.fm, and hit the contact page. Before we wrap up this episode, I had one quick note. The team here is going to be taking a break for the next couple of months. We're really heads down building a new venture. And a lot of what we're talking about here, about AI, operating models, how teams actually execute, are things that we're going to put further in practice in our next venture inside mid-market companies that we've been working with. We want to have more stories, more frameworks, more best practices, and more lessons learned for you. And we're going to be heads down doing that with our first set of clients. And we'll be back this summer with all of what we've learned. But in the meantime, if you're in the middle of this yourself, reach out to us. We'd love to help you in a more one-on-one capacity or with your team. And for everybody else, we'll see you back in the summer with more episodes on how to enable your team for this new era. Thank you so much to everyone who's listened, for the folks who've reached out, for the folks who've given us the 5-star ratings on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and other places where you consume your content. This has been a super fun ride. We'll be back on the other side of this pause. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.